Bonjour. Good morning. Welcome to Grassroots Church, a community of people who are spreading the selfless love of Jesus over the face of the earth. My name is Keith. I'm the lead and teaching pastor here at Grassroots, and I'm really glad that you are this morning jumping into worship with the community. Before I jump into what is my second of 5 sermons on the Christian marriage, on the gift of Christian marriage, I want to welcome you and to give a shout out to any who are new this morning. Maybe this is your first week as you jump into worship with Grassroots. If that's so, welcome to you. If you're returning to Grassroots from somewhere else, I am so glad that you're here this morning. And if you are just getting your tech up and going, if this is maybe your first or second week in online home church, I'm glad you're here, glad it's working for you. Just so you know, any of you, you are not late to the party. The party is just beginning, just getting going. We're figuring out what it is to be church and to do church in this time. So click on the links below to sing some songs from your living room this morning. If you have little ones running around distracting you, feel free to take church at your own pace throughout the day if you need, throughout the early morning or late morning or early afternoon or mid-afternoon, whatever it is for you. I'd invite you to jump in at your own pace. And if you are wanting a more live, interactive kind of church experience, what we're doing these days is we are running home groups. They are up and going, as well as prayer meetings, which are live online experiences. So if you are interested in those kinds of things, then feel free to email admin@grassroots.church and we'll get you connected up. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never gone through an experience like we're going through. I think very few of us have. And we might call this time and what we're going through a crucible experience. Now, crucibles are there's 2 kinds of things that we use the word crucible for. The first thing is the tangible thing. It's a tool that we use to heat fire up hot enough to melt metal. These kind of things, you may have seen them online. They are fiery red and burning, and they melt down gold and all sorts of liquid. And if our society completely collapses and you're in need of breaking down your gold into smaller pieces, you can get a crucible here on Amazon for less than $100. But we also use crucible, the word crucible, to describe an event or an experience or a series of events that are so transformative, they're so intense that they really do create something new. If you've gone through a crucible event or a series of events, you may have recognized that you walked into those events with some immaturity or maybe some things about you that weren't fully grown up. And as you have gone through the events and the crucible events, you come out the other side and you realize that maybe you're just a little more grown up than you were. Or maybe you walked into an experience where you didn't have a lot of confidence in yourself. Maybe you did something that was very difficult and challenging and you succeeded, or you came through it unscathed, or at least you made it through alive, and you got a boost in your confidence. That we can think about those as crucible events. Or maybe you had a bit of a self-exalted sense of your identity. Maybe you thought a little too much of yourself and you went through something hard and difficult and you came out the other side and you really truly were humbled and you lived life in a softer kind of way. These are crucible events, and in order to get through them, it takes a lot of challenge. Some people may have had an extreme adventure experience where maybe they were caught out hiking or in the middle of the ocean and they needed rescuing, and you come back on the other side of those and you realize that you are grateful just a little more for life in a way that you never were. These are crucible experiences. One of the most significant experiences that I've had that I would call a crucible is the birth of our eldest daughter, Claire. She was born a little after a year of even me being married. Her little heart started fluttering and beating inside of Eve a little sooner than we had planned and expected. And so we went through that year, experienced all kinds of intense emotions. I'm sure that it was a much more intense experience for Eve than me, since she was the one whose body was going through all the changes and who gave birth to Claire. Uh, and yeah, for both of us, we went through some really trying times as we were figuring out what it was to get ready to be parents a little too early, really. And so I remember the day in January 2007, when Claire was born. I had experienced such an incredible amount of joy as I held Claire in my arms, and I had come through something, and I was someone a little bit different. There was something new about me as I had gone through that experience. And when you go through these experiences, you need hope. You need a willingness to let go of what was passing away. You go past a certain amount of threshold of pain that you didn't know you could go past, and something really does get born in the world that wasn't here before, and it's rich and beautiful and lovely. And I think that we are going through one of these crucible moments right now as a society. And yet also, I believe that marriage, the experience of marriage, contains crucible dynamics as well that come on and they come off and they go in and out of season, and we experience them sometimes and other times we don't. Even in our own kind of dance of brokenness and in our dance of marriage, probably hit something like a mini crucible once a month, or if not every other month. But there are seasons and times, once a year, once every couple of years, where we really get into a situation that is very challenging for us. And I believe that God has put this dynamic in every marriage, in the institution of marriage, as He remakes us from darkness into light. And if we don't recognize this, if we don't recognize that God is doing this work, we can be mistaken about a lot of things. Sometimes we can give up far too soon on a relationship that we're meant to be in, or we can misunderstand the times where God is simply asking us to bear with a partner, and it may be something very challenging for us to do because our needs aren't getting met and our own sense of being filled up and loved by our partner isn't happening. And we can misunderstand that there are moments that God gives for us and means for us simply to be caregivers and supports. But we can also understand our fight and flight mechanisms when we get into challenging crucibles. And sometimes we can really get confused and think that there's something deeply wrong, and perhaps that we've even married the wrong person. So because we're in a challenging moment that we might call a crucible, and because marriage holds crucible dynamics, I think probably that this experience is going to engage crucible dynamics in marriages in more frequent ways, more intense ways. And so I want to preach on this. I want to open up the Bible to show us what God has to say about this, so that we can be prepared and ready for this. And I'm not going to talk about marriages, therefore, through the kind of usual lenses of here's how to be a better communicator, and here's how to be a better lover, and here's what to do with your in-laws, and here's what to do with finances. All of those are good things and great things to talk about in marriage, in a marriage series. But there's a lot of that out there. And I think right now, what's most important is that we focus and we come into the teaching on marriage through the frameworks of spiritual formation, on laying out for us the crucible dynamics. So last week I started this all out, giving us a big picture overview, opening up the conversation, saying that unless we capture a vision of the challenging aspects of marriage and how to embrace them, then we're going to really struggle in our satisfaction, especially as we approach these God-given transformational dynamics in marriage. And as I said last time, and I'll reiterate, I am no marriage expert. I'm not a marriage expert. I'm not a marriage therapist. And Eve can give you a testimony that there are times that are very few and far between that I am unlovable. That may happen once or twice in a blue moon, but sometimes I can be a challenge to be a partner with. And so as we do so, what I'm saying is that I'm in the thick of it with you. I am not an expert. I can lead you through the scriptures. I have 13 years of experience under my belt, and I can really help you along if you've got some questions about the Bible, about theology, about and then just some of the practicalities of having a good biblical marriage relationship. But there are things that I may not be able to help you with, and I can direct you in the right direction if if you need help. So please make yourself known, make your needs known in this time, and we can try to help out. Also, I'm encouraging us, I'll say it again, and I said it last week, I'm encouraging every person in our church, whether you're married or not, to engage in this teaching. From time to time, it's really good for us all to engage in a study and a deeper look at God's biblical view of marriage. And there are many reasons why people that are called to the single life should study this. There are many reasons why people who are called to the married life and aren't yet married should study this. And there are many reasons why people who have been married or divorced or widowed should enter into this. And I talked a little bit about that last week. Also, finally, I said it last week, I'll say it again. I am not going to engage in conversations here about gender or identity or sexuality. I think these are big and difficult and complex topics, and I'm happy to talk about them with you, but I don't want them to distract from the basic point that I'm making in these sermons, that God has created these relationships to change and to form us. So I opened last week our central text, which was Ephesians chapter 5, a key verse which may not be the one you've focused on in the past. Whoever hated their body, but we feed and we care for our own body. This verse is in the context of Paul talking about a husband's responsibility to care for his wife as he cares for himself. And I put this teaching in the light of verse Ephesians 4, in which we started to talk about maturity and how the Christian life is about growing up into the maturity of Christ, so that we should expect marriage to do that same kind of work, and how the kind of maturity that Paul describes is not just a childishness, but something more dark and deep and sinister. And we recognize in all of this that if we're really honest with ourselves, honest about our experience of marriage, that our greatest need is not to be loved, because God, our Heavenly Father, loves us perfectly already. He already does. So we don't really need that like sometimes we think. But what we really need is those deep, selfish, dark corners of our hearts to be transformed. Our greatest need is not to be loved, but to learn how to love in return, so that marriage truly is an academy for the formation of love. So in the coming weeks, I've got some very practical teaching on marriages and how this all kind of works out, especially as you think about forgiveness and bearing with one another, patience and sacrificial giving and being humble and gentle. And we're moving in that direction, and we'll arrive there. And I think when we do, the teaching will help you out quite a bit. But there's so much out there on this already, and I'd like to focus in today a little more on the crucible dynamics of marriage, because marriage can sometimes be a very ragged experience if we are captive to the very powerful forces that sometimes exist in a marriage relationship. And we ask our questions when we're in those powerful dynamics, when we feel out of control or we feel trapped. We think, is there something wrong with me? Have I done something wrong? And if there are dynamics that are too strong and I feel helpless and defeated, is separation and divorce the only option? And I think the answer to these things comes in if we see something. If we're willing to see what the purpose of marriage is. And when we do so, when we see what I'm asking us to see here, we enter into relationships with a greater ability to pray the prayer, Father, not my will, but yours be done. And we enter into that great prayer, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. When we see what I'm asking us to see, we can turn from feeling dejected and disappointed into joining God with compassion in the healing of our lovers. We recognize, and this is what I'm asking us to see, that God has put something very explicit in the middle of our marriage relationships, and it's there to shake selfishness out of us. It's there to transform the deeper parts of our heart and turn us from selfish people into people who know how to be compassionate. So this is a delicate teaching. This is not an easy teaching. but a crucial one. And I want to be able to unpack this, and it's difficult to do in this format because we kind of are limited by time, by 20 minutes, but 20-minute chunks. And so I'm going to invite us further into it today. I may go a little longer. I may choose to break up the teaching into 2 videos to make it easier to watch. But either way, I'm going to get into this, inviting you into it, even though it's not very easy. So in chapter 4 of Ephesians, Paul is teaching on marriage. That's where we're going to jump in. Last time we closed off with a quick overview of Ephesians chapter 4, and I gave you some homework, and so that's where we're going to begin today. And when he, in chapter 4, describes the growth of Christian maturity, he does so in telling us that God does not want us to be hard-hearted, but rather he's teaching us to bear patiently with one another in love. God does not want us to be tossed about by the emotions and the feelings that we have, or tossed about by the poor and the sick teachings on marriage that our culture gives us. Maybe the messages we receive, whether we've known it or not, from the latest wedding movie that we've watched, or from wherever they come, from advertisements or whatnot. Paul doesn't want us to be tossed about by these things, but rather he tells us to be engaged in the changing of the attitudes of our mind, the transformation of our minds. Rather than brewing in anger and letting our tongues loose at one another, we are learning to discipline our tongues and say really only what is needed to build another person up. See, these are the Christian maturity. This is Christian maturity in the shape of Jesus. And this is really important for marriages, this last piece. And I really struggle with this one. You see something in your spouse that you don't understand, or you see something in your partner that seems like you half understand it, or it seems sinful, or it seems off, and you're quick to point it out. You just sort of let your tongue fly, let it loose. And really at the end of the day, rather than someone feeling freed and built up and encouraged and cherished, they feel torn down. And Paul's saying there's a way to get out of that kind of being. He's going to challenge his followers to act in a way that's patently Christian. So different than what sometimes we experience in our marriage relationships. And here's how he's going to say it. He's going to sum it up like this. For once you were in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. So again, we recognize that Christian light is about moving from and being changed, moving from one thing to another, from an old and broken person to something new. And by saying that we were once darkness and now in the Lord, it's almost as if Paul is saying that we once lived in the house of darkness and we learned to act in the ways of that house. But now that we live in the house of the Lord, we better not act in the same way that we once used to. We better act in the way that the Lord wants us. So if we think about this in terms of character and relationships, Paul's not just framing this up in the framework of immaturity and maturity. He's not saying you were once immature and now you are mature. He's not saying you once were ignorant and now you are knowledgeable. He's saying you were once in darkness and now you are in light. It's something more powerful if we're going to catch the Bible's vision for what the human person is made of. And if we're going to be able to see what I'm asking us to see about marriages, this is the first key piece. Recognizing the depths of our darkness, and even though it's not fun in the first place, and that's, I'm not preaching on this because this is fun, but I believe that when God created marriages, He had the reality of the human condition in mind. So listen to how Paul is going to say this. If you read through chapter 4, he's like, don't let your hearts be hardened, but rather have them transformed into something soft, into something that is malleable and open to other people. So human hearts, Paul is saying, is not just the place of emotions and where we feel things deeply, but it's something that's alive and vibrant and can be actually hardened. Losing sensitivity to one another. You can be tired of being hurt. You can be tired of losing trust in another person. You can shut off your heart to another person and exist in cold, icy isolation from other people. This is describing the times maybe where we realize that we're no longer infatuated with our partner. In fact, something like resentment is beginning to exist. That I am going to be out for number one now. I'm going to close myself off to everyone. And if you know humans with a hard heart, you recognize that hard hearts don't always soften. they sometimes can be hard for a very, very long time. In the heat of battle, we can forget sometimes that human hearts are prone to hardening. You remember this when Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees when they asked about divorce. They said, well, Matthew tells us that the Pharisees came to test Jesus. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? See, the Pharisees want to know if marriage is expendable. And there was a whole group of Jewish people in Jesus' day, some of the scribes and the rabbis who were teaching that marriage was expendable in this way. You can divorce your wife for any reason that you want. And the Pharisees are coming to test Jesus to see if that he will teach this as well. And Jesus, instead of doing one thing or the other, he decides to ramp up the significance of marriage by quoting Genesis. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, and here's his point, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Jesus isn't saying that it's impossible to separate marriages. In fact, marriages, two people can be ripped apart. But Jesus is saying, let no person pursue this. Let no person be the cause of this. And so instead of kind of being tricked into what they're trying to trick him into, Jesus takes the opportunity to say, this is a sanctified, holy, important, essential kind of relationship that should not be taken lightly. And then to try to capture him in a trick, they asked, well, then why did Moses allow for divorce? And instead, and even more than this, they said, why did Moses command divorce? You see that if a woman in the Jewish culture, and this was across the board, if a woman was caught in adultery, the husband had to divorce her under Mosaic law. He had to. There was no option for him to forgive her or for them to try to work on the relationship. He was forced to divorce her. But Jesus put an end to this way of thinking, opening up the possibility for a husband to forgive his wife or a wife to forgive her cheating husband. Now, Jesus leaves the option open, doesn't say that that's necessary, that's essential. But Jesus is saying this was not the way it was from the beginning. You see, Moses didn't command divorce, but he permitted you to divorce your wives. Why? Because your hearts were hard. This is not how it was supposed to be. And Jesus says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife flippantly, like they were asking for any reason, except for an impure matter, and marries another woman commits adultery. So this opens up a lot of questions which I cannot get into here. But Jesus is asking spouses to work through and be open to the changing of the hardness of heart that can exist. And just as Paul was suggesting, and the main point that I'm trying to make here is that hardness of heart is part of the old way of being. It's the darkness, it's the immaturity. And if you find that your heart is hard towards your spouse, Jesus is calling you, asking you to do something about it. Don't just sit in the hardness of heart. Bring your heart to God. Bring your hardness to God and see if God can't heal that. But we recognize in all of this, and here's the point, that hardness of heart is part of being human. Our hearts can get hard. They're susceptible to closing off. But Paul gives us another category. Humans are also prone to deceit. From inside their brains, they can believe lies that their own brains make up, and they can believe lies that come into them from the outside. And this deceit that drives us to seek personal fulfillment, this deceit, these lies that swirl around us about identity and marriage and who we are and fulfillment, all of these lies can enter, and we can start pursuing sexual behaviors, Paul says, that are impure because they hurt us. They hurt our bodies. They hurt other people. And we can get our minds so closed off. And whether it's advertisements or what it is, something can happen. Lies can start getting whispered into our ear. And when we do so, we start getting into yelling matches and brawling and malice, Paul's saying. And it's not a pretty picture, but it's almost like watching someone turn against the very person that God has given them to cherish and adore. and begin believing half lies and half spun truths. And Paul is saying that our mind can be overrun with all these ideas, that we can begin to complain bitterly and be filled with all sorts of things. And if you're trying to catch my drift here still, what I'm saying is that when you get married to a human. And that human gets married to another human. And this means that being with humans is that we are going to be with them in their worst of times, when their hearts get hard, when they believe half-truths, when they believe half-lies. And another person is called to stay faithful to us when we get in that state as well. So what? What do we do with this? Well, first of all, you see how different this is from our culture's view for what we're looking for in a spouse. In our culture's mind, what we're expecting is to find a fully rational human being who we hope has none of these deficiencies that I just described, but they fill our need, and who will understand all of our intentions well and be impermeable to lies from in their minds or from outside of them. They'll not struggle with sexual perversions, because why would they? We're fulfilling them perfectly as it is, right? And they will always represent us. They will always represent me with the best of intentions and in the best light, because who would have any reason to complain to being married to me? And they'll never, of course, be prone to anger. And what's the job of dating and marriage in this framework? It's to fan the flames of marital desire and create a bastion of peace around us. And so many of us spend our time and energy and resources on building this kind of relationship. As one author put it, we expect to feel magnetized and full of luscious energy in the company of a lover, a heightened interest in sex, a strong focus on our partner's positive qualities, a reordering of daily priorities to spend as much time together as possible, and daydreaming and fantasizing about our said lover even when they're apart. See, the Bible comes nowhere close to permitting this view of marriage and humanity. Because we are less, the truth of it is we are less like rational lovers and more like half brainwashed zombies, or brainwashed half zombies, however you put it, who God is doing everything in his power to heal and free from all of our diseases. And if you don't believe me, long-termers, which of these two pictures most exemplifies your spouse? Okay, I'm going to sit here for a minute and let you try to be honest with yourself. Now, my point is not to be hard on you, but to help recalibrate your expectations, your understanding about what this relationship is truly about in God's eyes. And by the way, see if you can take in the reality that it's brainwashed, half zombies, that Jesus chooses to be his bride. But if this isn't bad enough, if God's work is to do delicate, like brain surgery, to turn us from darkness into light, Paul is telling us, if you read on in Ephesians chapter 6, that he's doing this on an active battlefield. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power, says Paul. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And Paul goes on to talk about the kinds of armor that we need in order to be protected in this ongoing battle, and how that we can expect flaming arrows to be shot at us from the enemy. If marriage sometimes seems hard, here's why. And it's amazing in this context, if this is the way it really is, that marriages can survive. But they can, because of God's mighty power at work every day. So, what do we come up with here? Half brainwashed zombies, susceptible to flaming arrows of the enemy, with whom we are coupled. And we are asked to help and heal them. And while sometimes we struggle with the toxins of our own our own illnesses, spiritual illnesses. Our main job in this all is compassion, learning to be compassionate, that God is working out the salvation. But oftentimes we're sitting around, aren't we, with the world's narrative in our mind, stroking our pain, saying, I'm no longer infatuated. She doesn't complete me after all. I resent him for stealing my dreams. I'm going to blow my lid when this creature struggles with darkness. Or I think I can fix them. Or I'm not getting what I need from them. And this is why this relationship is not this rational picture of desire, but something more like the washing of a beloved bride. And takes us back to the heart of Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. And you can see the goal there of a bride that's just described by many words, but you can just say she's full of light. And you see, Jesus, here's the thing, Jesus isn't waiting for someone else to make this bride holy, to present this beautiful bride to him, but he is in the process presenting her to himself. So marriage can be healing, it can be fun, but sometimes a dragon comes out, and it's like an arena, and you have to know how to survive or you're going to be torn to shreds. And a significant part of this is coming to have compassion, learning to see your partner as a compromised human being in process, healing, a child of the King. But if this is marriage, how do we do this? And this is really where we're going to be heading next week. What does it look like to have compassion in a marriage when it gets rough? But I have to do two things first, and I'm gonna just, it'll take me a few minutes here to do this, but I'm going to say a couple of things, and they're really my first takeaways here. First, the first thing we have to do in the midst of all this is we first have to assess how our vows are going. And second, we need to be people who pray. So first thing, if things are really bad, if things have gotten to a really bad kind of state, if you think you could describe where you're at as persistently distressed, if you feel trapped, you feel in lots of pain, what do we do about this? How do we understand this in this light? So, and I suspect that there are many, many people in this position, in this posture, more than they are letting on. Because we can survive in this kind of mode for a long time as humans. So the first thing, assess your vows. Usually our vows, the things that we say and promise to one another on our wedding day, can be organized into two kinds of things. One of them is physical, the other emotional, providing physical needs and emotional needs in the best of times, in the richest of times, in the worst of times, in the poorest of times. And this can come down to the words cherish and respect. Our vows are to cherish and respect one another. Our vows are, as Paul says in a different place in this chapter, to feed and to care for them. So marriage requires a lot of faithfulness. But if these vows are being persistently and explicitly broken by one partner or the other, a marriage can die. If someone is physically abusing you, if they're breaking your things, if they're using their body to inflict force upon you, if they are outright battering you down with their bodies or with their words, you need safely to find your way out of this scenario. You need to enter into a separation from this person as they deal with their darkness and the darkness that they are overcome with. You need safely to find your way out. And I know that this can be a very tricky thing, but if this is you, if you need to find a way out, email me, call me, get a hold of me today. And I can direct you to someone who can walk you through safely how to get out of this situation. And this is pretty straightforward. If this person, if they cannot repent or get the help they need for their outright acts of abuse, they have killed your marriage. And you need to be out of the covenant. And remember, Jesus doesn't say these bonds can't be separated. He says, let no one separate them. And this is different than cannot be separated. But there can be more subtle breakdowns in marriage, and usually they are more subtle. And it can be very confusing when sometimes to know when a marriage is going through a long season of crucible and when it simply is dying. And because we want to take marriage as seriously as Jesus teaches us, we have not just to jump out of these seasons of trial, but we have to walk through a very long and sometimes painful process, a very costly process, sometimes to see if the marriage is dying. If there is sort of shared, subtle emotional abuse or neglect, or the mixing of sins in a terrible way that's extremely and ongoingly painful, the first step is to ask for help. Get a counselor. There are professionals whose job is to help you. Now, some might say, I don't have the money to pay for this. Well, there are options in this city that don't require a lot of money, and I can help you find them if you need. But if you're going to pay for a therapist, it may cost you between $3,000 and $5,000 a year to go through counseling. And that may seem like a lot of money, but if you have to get separated, you're going to spend $3,000 to $5,000 very quickly in 3 months on having to rent another place. And divorce is one of the most costly things in all of this life. And this is something that people don't often think about, how costly marriage is, or as costly divorce is. And so get counseling. Get some counseling if you need it. Your partner, they may refuse to see a counselor. And sometimes people say, well, I don't want to see a counselor because they'll turn against me, or they'll take your side. This is hogwash. This is just a way for them to say that they don't want to really deal with what's in front of them. But you can't make them. You cannot make your partner see a counselor. And you shouldn't try really to force them into it, because it really won't be helpful unless they go willingly. And so if they refuse, then you can go see a counselor on your own. Find the time, find the investment to see someone to help you through the extremely painful situation that you find yourself in. And if this doesn't work and there's not repentance, and after much prayer and agonizing, you recognize that your partner is not changing and you're stuck in pain and you're stuck in a painful experience, then you need to engage in what we call a redemptive separation, where you do move out, you do separate your lives for a time in order for darkness to be healed and for you to come back together. That's the intention. But during this time, if you realize that the darkness isn't changing, your partner isn't actually getting help, and you have to be careful, because there's so many tricky motives that we can have. But if your partner isn't getting help and you've gotten help and you've separated, then you may have to come to the realization that your marriage is in fact dead. If you get to this point as you grieve and you walk through this terrible scenario, remember, it's always important to remember that divorce is not a sin, but the breaking of marriage vows is what is sinful. Remember that God is in the business of restoration and redemption and even resurrection. I say this not because I want anyone to pursue divorce. Hear me, I do not want you to pursue divorce lightly. I don't want you to pursue it at all. I want you to get help. But if this is the case, if you need to move in this direction, if your marriage has died, we recognize that humans are not meant to live in situations of perpetual abandonment and rejection. Jesus knows this, God knows this, and he will care for you if you end up in this terrible way. And that's what the question is. What do you do when darkness overcomes this relationship? You cling to Jesus, you walk the long road of restoration, hopefully resurrection, but don't be ashamed to get help. I think there are probably so many people walking around ashamed to get help because they think they're the only ones going through this. They're the only ones that are experiencing this. And the reality is that you are not alone. And the church is here to help. So make yourself known. And there is such thing as a marital death. But with that teaching now passed, with us getting through that point, we're now entering what we can say are the more insidious and complex crucible dynamics that we go through. And there's a lot to talk about here. And there's a lot of space that we're called to exist in that requires marital faithfulness. And so many people run away from this experience and they call it something like irreconcilable differences. At the heart of the crucible dynamics of marriage is this truth, that if you cannot get on board with learning to be faithful and to love and to help heal that someone that you once loved but now may be really annoyed with or becoming to despise or dislike, you haven't yet glimpsed the heart of Jesus. And the zombie-like darkness, which can be in all of us, is still in you. If you can't bring yourself into this kind of way. So what do we do with this space? And this is where we're heading. This is what next week's sermon is going to be about. So your homework this week, so there it is. We assess our vows. How are we doing with our vows? And we walk the long process of healing and restoration. But if we find ourselves from time to time and very often in these sort of crucible moments, what do we do with this? How do we get involved? And that's what I'm going to talk about next week. But your homework for this week is to find somebody to pray with. If you're married, try praying with your spouse 3 times this week. Verbally, out loud, pray for what's on your heart. Pray for them. Have them pray for you. And if you're not married, if you're called to the single life, if you are someone who is divorced or widowed or called to be married but not yet married, find someone else to pray with this week. Find someone to pray with 3 times. That's my challenge for you this week. And if you have no one, if you have no one that you can think of to pray with, let me know. I will connect you with our prayer warriors at church who will be more than happy to connect with you, to pray with you 3 times this week. So that's where we're heading, folks, and making the important point, how crucial prayer is going to be in this context. So more to come. Stay tuned. Have a blessed week. See you next time.